Hello, this is Superintendent Rottinghouse, and I'm taking a little bit of time here to provide you with the opportunity to find out about some of the key components of the Pawnee City Public School COVID-19 reopening plan for 2021. The Board of Education approved this on Monday evening at a special board meeting, and I wanted to take this opportunity to just touch upon some of the more important things as it pertains to students when they come back to the school. I encourage you to go to our school website and read this entire document if you're so inclined, but I thought this video may provide an opportunity for parents and students to have an idea of what to expect when school resumes on August 4th. So I'd like to start by talking about on this plan. I've highlighted sections that I want to specifically talk about or draw attention to. But on this plan, I want to talk about the modes of operation in which the school will function. So we will have 3 modes of operation, which you can see highlighted here below in the colors of green, orange, and red. And the green mode is considered low or moderate spread. And we will have some restrictions in place, some obvious ones, and a number of others in great detail. And then, but we'll still have in-person instruction. High spread, we will continue to have in-person instruction, but there'll be more efforts to restrict interaction between students to prevent the spread of the virus. And then when we get into severe spread mode is when the school building will be closed. And we'll get into the details of this in several different categories of day-to-day school operation. We'll particularly focus on the ones that pertain to students and not the ones that don't pertain to students. But again, if you're interested in reading about those, you can read the entire document on the school website. The purpose of the different levels or modes of operation are to be consistent with the risk that has been assessed for Pawnee County by the Southeast District Health Department. They will be providing, putting us in one of 4 categories: low, moderate, high, or severe spread, based on empirical data that they gather. When we are in either the low or moderate spread, we will continue to operate under the guidelines herein, and so on and so forth for high and severe spread. So that being said, we'll first talk about some of the pertinent general provisions. The provisions in this document shall supersede any other board policies, handbooks, provisions, or safety plans. In other words, there may be things in the handbooks as they're written or the policies as they're written that conflict with this plan. Rather than change all of those policies and plans and handbooks, the board just decided that this document would supersede anything that is in writing until such time that it's no longer a document that's necessary when the pandemic has concluded. I want to talk here a general provision about quarantining. If a student, and this would be true for a staff member as well, it does test positive for COVID-19, we are requiring that they quarantine until they can provide a doctor's note indicating that they no longer have the virus. If you do come in contact, a student comes in contact with someone who has COVID-19, then it's the expectation of the parent and students to conduct a quarantine as they've been instructed by the health department or health agency that has contacted you. Because we don't have access to some of the HIPAA information, this protected information for students, it's really impossible for us to enforce those quarantines. So we're asking that families work to the best of their ability. If we become aware of a situation where an individual in a particular group has tested positive, we will do our best to notify parents as soon as we're able, so that they can make an educated decision as to whether they think it's safe for their children to attend school in person. Moving on to attendance and makeup work, and then excused absences. First, want to point out that depending upon which risk mode we're in, students must be in attendance or not in attendance if they're enrolled at Pawnee City Public Schools. We will not be providing a hybrid plan, so to speak, where students can learn either online or at the school at the same time. However, if a student does have a disability that would cause them to have underlying conditions, certainly we can use the laws and rules that are already in effect, particularly the IEP special education process and the 504 plan, Section 504 of the American Disabilities Act, to look at making accommodations for alternate learning settings if a student's disability does put them at a higher risk. Want to also point out that in this last paragraph that's highlighted in the screen, as you can see it, that students who are quarantined, or students who even are staying home because they have symptoms that are consistent with COVID or because they're running a fever, all we need is a parent note, and we will count that as a medically excused absence. That means that absence will not apply toward your the student's 20 days that would apply toward tardy. So under this, we just need a parent note indicating that they were staying home because of COVID-related symptoms, be it quarantining, and we will excuse that. Also, I would like to point out that any schoolwork is expected to be, due to quarantining or illness, is expected to be made up by students in the same manner as it would be in the student handbook. So if a student has to make up work, we'll just work through the school, or instruction, we'll just work through the school to make up that work. So the first category that we talk about for each of the three risk modes is logistics and transitions. So want to point out here, as it's highlighted, students in the morning are not going to be allowed to enter the cafeteria. We're trying to avoid those large gatherings. Students also will not be allowed to enter the buildings until 7:50 a.m. I want to point out that if a student has a temperature of 100.4 degrees, then he or she may not attend school. There may be scenarios where we wait if a student has been doing some physical activity, cause their body heat to rise. We may rescreen 2 or 3 times to make sure it's not just an anomaly, but we will be screening students as they enter each building to see if they are running a fever. We'll be using touchless thermometers. Before they can enter the building, students in grades 6 through 12 will be required to wear a face mask, and that's going to be discussed in a little more detail here later on. Students must report directly to their classrooms. So for 6-12 students, that would be whichever class they have for first period. So if you are a student that shows up, you can stop, go to your locker, but then you're not expected to be able to hang out in the hallway. You're expected to report to your classroom some point between 7:50 and before the first class begins at 8:10. Hand sanitizer will be made available. It'll be expected to be applied to hands basically after every transition and when students arrive in the building. Before we move on to the next page, I want to point out that logistics and transitions are really not relevant during severe spread category, because during severe spread, the school will be closed to students. The next page talks a little bit about visitors. Visitors will be required to wear face masks when they come into the building. We want to limit our visitors to individuals necessary for the support of education of children. Under this plan, parents, grandparents, student family members, etc., will only be allowed into the school on an emergency basis or for a scheduled meeting such as an IEP meeting. If you come to the school to drop off an item that a student may have left at home, you can bring it to the office, but we're not going to allow parents to go beyond that point. I know there's sometimes parents want to come in and have lunch, for example, or grandparents want to have lunch with their children or their grandchildren. And during this pandemic, that's just not going to be feasible to be consistent with our planning process. We will provide cloth or disposable face masks to students who do not have them. We're in the process of getting a lot of the reusable, washable face masks. More information will be coming about those. We also have individualized ones with the Pawnee City logo on it. One of those will be checked out to each student who wants one. And then we will also have several of the reusable ones, and details about how those are to be used will be provided to students when they arrive. None of those have arrived at the school, but we do have disposable ones at this time to use before those would arrive if they would not happen to arrive by August 4th. So the times in which students in grades 6 to 12 are required to wear face masks is during passing times and time spent in common areas. Students will be allowed to remove their face mask when arriving in their classroom and at their seats if students' chairs are able to be spread out enough and distanced. We kind of like to look at that 6 feet distance with the CDC guidance. It will ultimately be classroom teachers and school personnel who make those decisions. We also may put in conditions where a staff member is particularly at risk. We have another student in a class that's particularly at risk. And during that class period, we are going to want all of the students to keep their face masks on the entire time. There may be situations where a student's disability prevents them from wearing a face mask. We may consider through a special 504 IEP plan using face shields instead of face masks. It's important to point out that that not wearing a face mask as directed by a staff member is something that is potentially could have consequences based on discipline policy in the student handbooks. So that is something that we want you to take into consideration also. Looking here toward the bottom, we are not requiring, other than on school bus routes and on activity routes, which will be discussed in the next section, for students in grades pre-K through 5 to be required to wear face masks. And this is true for, because it's listed above as well. If parents do want their child to wear a face mask, regardless of their age, throughout the entire day, we will have an opt-in form available that will allow for parents to say that they do want their child to wear face masks throughout the day. Those are not available yet at this time, but will be made available prior to the start of the school year. But if we do not receive one of those opt-in forms, we will assume that the parent only wants their child to wear a face mask during the times that it's required by the district. Transportation. We will be putting for bus routes this year, we will be putting monitors on the bus to administer screenings, temperature screenings before a student gets on the bus in the morning, and also to help maintain conduct on the bus. On school buses is the one location where all students, regardless of their age, regardless if they're in preschool or if they are seniors, they will have to wear face masks while they're being transported. And I want to point out that these conditions apply whether we're in low, moderate, or high spread. There's some sections that are broken down a little more specifically, some that are not. So if we arrive at a residence and a student has a fever or a temperature running above 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe we wait a minute or 2 or 3 and do a retest to make sure it wasn't due to them maybe running down the driveway too quickly, students are not allowed to come to school that day. So that means that the parent will need to stay at home. There could be situations where the parent has already left, and we have some guidelines put in place here. If no parent is home, the bus monitor will call and notify before leaving the residence. If we feel for any reason it's unsafe to leave a child at home without a parent, the monitor will remain there with them. And even if no parent is home and we can't get a hold of a parent, and for any reason, maybe the temperature is too cold or conditions outside are just not favorable, we will even if it's child and we cannot get a hold of the parents and the parents are not home, we will put the child on the bus and try to isolate them as much as possible, and then bring them to school and isolate them until the parent can be contacted. So parents, we just really ask that you, before you send your kids to school, whether they get on a bus or whether they are driving or walking to school, really to make sure that they're not running a fever, because we don't want to have to send kids home. We really would prefer that to be something that you detect and just to prevent these types of situations that can be complicated for both the parent and the district. When the students get on the bus, they will all apply hand sanitizer. We will have assigned seating arrangements, which is addressed a little bit lower here. Students from the same household will sit together. If we need to double or triple up, we will have a separate seating arrangement based on morning and afternoon routes. And it really has to do with students will be seated not necessarily in order by age, but in order that they get on the bus. So the early on will sit at the back, the last on will sit toward the front. And much the same, the first off in the afternoon will sit toward the front, the last off will sit toward the back. So to avoid crossing paths. I also want to point out that things like birthday parties were in the past that students may have, a group of students may have rode on a bus to get dropped off at a household for a birthday party, or for students that got dropped off at a location for religion. That's not going to be allowed. Only students on assigned routes with assigned dropped off designations will, whether it's their primary residence or whether it's their alternate drop-off location on their assigned route, only those students and those drop-off locations will be allowed until this pandemic subsides. And we will sanitize the surfaces of the buses after every trip. There's a few more details here for the two different, the first two risk models, or excuse me, risk modes. Feel free to read those, but I'm going, for the purposes of time, I'm going to skip over those. Want to get into custodial and health, and really here the only thing that I want to talk about as it pertains to students is, once again, the students that have a temperature of 104 need to stay home, need to be home for at least 24 hours without, from the time after their fever broke, for 24 hours without the assistance of Tylenol or ibuprofen or something of that nature. There's a number of symptoms that are listed here that come from the CDC. If staff or students have these symptoms, we're asking that they stay home unless the symptoms can be obviously the result of other explainable circumstances. So for example, if a student did something out of the ordinary and they have achy muscles, and that's obviously where the pain is at, then that would not be a reason to keep a child home. Moving on then to instruction and class size. We have been diligently working all summer to spread out desks and try to socially distance our classrooms to the extent possible. That's not always going to be able to be 6 feet. Some classrooms have smaller groups of kids, some, particularly in the high school, have smaller groups of students based on what class it is. Others have larger. So how close they will sit in any given class period will vary, obviously, from classroom to classroom and from period to period. In the lower moderate spread mode of instruction, students' school supplies will be limited, shared supplies like community share will be limited to the degree possible. And of course, when we do have to do that, we will sanitize before we give it to another student. In the elementary, instruction won't change a lot, but there are a few changes to be noted. Outdoor recess will be allowed if the weather conditions allow for it. But we will not be going inside for recess. We will not have recess in the gym when the weather, rain, extreme cold does not allow for it outside, just simply because the social distancing in the structure is just not going to be effective in our limited indoor activity spaces. We will instead provide structured activity time in the classroom in place of recess during those times. We'll talk about breakfast and lunch a little bit later on in the food service section. Just some of the other special subjects where students typically leave their elementary students leave the classroom. Rather than going to the art room, the art teacher will come to the classroom and move between classrooms. Students who are in recorders or band will still be able to report to the band room and play recorders or play their instruments, and chairs in there are adequately spaced out. Our elementary computer lab is very tightly. The computers sit very close to each other. So we will instead, until the pandemic subsides, teach computer instruction in the classrooms using students' one-to-one devices, either Chromebooks or, for grades kindergarten and first grade, iPads. Now in the secondary building, for grades 6 through 12, instruction will remain typical with the following. These are some of the following conditions that I want to point out. We will follow a normal bell schedule. We won't do any type of staggered bell schedule. As I've already mentioned, we want students to wear face masks when they're in transition. We'll talk about lunch a little bit more in detail, but breakfast will only be allowed to be eaten in the classroom. Again, comparable to the elementary, band instruction will be provided. Vocal will be allowed, but it will occur in the auditorium for the high school. Because of the large group, we will space them out in the chairs in the auditorium, whereas in the elementary, we will have vocal instruction in the vocal classroom with chairs adequately spaced out. Okay. For instruction in the high spread category, not a lot will change for the elementary, other than we're going to really start to limit how much kids are going to be able to move around. That could affect particularly band and vocal. So we may look at alternate ways to deliver those, to provide education in art and band, but without as much, to promote social distancing and to avoid interaction of students to the degree possible. Now in the secondary building, when we're in the high spread mode, things will change significantly. Here, instruction will move from direct interactive learning to asynchronous online learning. So every student will be assigned to a homeroom, which is a class, which we're calling a homeroom classroom, where they'll spend most of their day. And these will be static groups. They will not change from day to day, so that if we have an isolated case, we can limit the spread exposure to fewer groups of people. Instruction will be provided online in the building where students have very dependable high-speed internet and have adults to provide structure. So it will be an online learning setting, but it will be under the supervision of teachers. So the teachers in those classrooms that are supervising will both be working on their instruction, online instruction and grading, at the same time that they're supervising students who are assigned to their classroom as for the homeroom. We will develop schedules to promote social distancing for students or small groups, individual students or small groups of students to leave for things like special education support or other support services, or if they need to talk to a specific teacher about who's in the building about subject matter. If it's something that can't be explained, maybe over the telephone or through electronic communication. Students, because we need a quiet setting and students will need probably to listen to some audio instruction and possibly some videos, they will need to provide most students already have these, but they will need to provide their own headphones, earphones, or earbuds. With regard to workload and weighting of assignments for grades 6 through 12, or all grades really during this time, the weighting and instruction, the amount of instruction, the amount of assignments, and the weight of the assignments will remain the same as it does when we are doing direct in-person interactive instruction. And then when we get into the severe spread mode, obviously students are going to be staying home. The building is going to be closed to students. During the first week of closure, we're basically going to consider that no school days, much like if we had a snow day. It's a day that would have to be made up in the spring. Then we will make a determination, the superintendent, myself, will make a determination if it appears that through communication with the health district, if we're going to remain in the severe spread mode for more than a week, we'll get the word out to parents that we're going to transition to online learning. That means students will be allowed to check out their one-to-one devices, which we now have for all students in grades kindergarten through 12, Chromebooks or iPads. We know that some families have limited internet access, so we do have US Cellular internet hotspots. They work better in some locations than others. We'll work with families to provide those as we're able, and they work for families, with the families that have service. Many of the locations where our families live, they do have very good service, but others they don't. But for families that do have internet, we ask that you just use your own internet. The days that we'll have instruction would correspond with when we do have, if hopefully we don't have to, but if we would have to go to online instruction, the days that we have online instruction would be the same days that we would have had school if we would be in session. So if it's Christmas break, or if it's Thanksgiving break, or if it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we would not have school online learning because we wouldn't be in person on those days. It will be. Now, this is a change from last spring when we had to make an abrupt decision and didn't really have any time to plan. Unlike last spring, we are going to make all assignments mandatory for all students. Now, of course, for our younger, particularly younger students of preschool and kindergarten, it's kind of limited with what we can do. But when we get into first grade and on up, we are going to have assignments that are graded and entered into PowerSchool, and they will be mandatory, which means if they're not done, then they will go into the grade book and count against the student. Now, we know that students have a limited ability to have the structure that they might have had at school in some situations for some families. So we are making some accommodations. For grades 3 through 12, we will reduce our workload to approximately 75% per subject, as it would have been if we were in person. And then for grades 1 and 2, we'll drop that down to about 50% roughly. And then for grades 3 through 12, for assignments you turn in, will be weighted at approximately half of what it would have been if you were learning in person. For grades 1 and 2, it'll be weighted at about 25%, as if you were in the building. So yes, assignments will have to be done. They won't count against the student as much if they're not done, but they are still expected to be done. Okay, moving on to personnel. We're going to skip personnel because that really doesn't pertain directly to students. We've already talked a little bit about this, but breakfast will be prepared and placed in grab-and-go bags and made available to students at the point of service stations in the morning. Students will take breakfast bags with them to eat in the classroom. We haven't worked out specifically how this will work, but it will likely be first thing in the morning in the elementary building, and then between first and second periods in the secondary building. When we have lunch, we will have seconds and a la carte food items prepackaged to request at the original point of service. There again, to avoid potential for potential spread of airborne pathogens. Students can still bring their own lunches to school, eat in the same location they would have otherwise eaten. We may have limited ability, particularly in the elementary, to have access to a microwave. So you may want it, for students that bring their lunches, may want to look to using having cold food options, or such as sandwiches, versus something that would need to be warmed up. For lower moderate spread, elementary, regardless, when we're in session, regardless if we're in low, moderate, or high, the elementary students will be eating in their classrooms. So they will walk to the lunchroom, they will receive a tray with that has a bag tray cover, and they'll walk it back to their classroom, other than for preschool, where we will deliver to the classroom. And then it talks about the specifics, but I don't need to go over that, about how we will gather up trays and those sort of things. Students in grades 6 through 12 will have when we're in the low or moderate spread category, we'll eat in the lunchroom, but we're going to adjust the layout to promote social distancing as much as possible. I won't click on this layout diagram right now, but if you're interested, feel free to take a look at that. We've done our best to try to balance the two lunch times for 6 and 12 to be as equal as possible. We're expecting secondary students to wear their face masks when they're in line, as they receive their tray, and until they arrive at their location where they'll be eating. And then we ask that they only take their face mask off during the time that they are eating. Okay, when we get the one major change here for when we get into high spread mode, since all students are pretty much in their classroom all day, that students will be all students, not just pre or kindergarten through 5, but all students in grades K through 12 will be going to the lunchroom in staggered groups so that they can bring their meal back and eat in the classroom. I think one thing I may have skipped over during instructional time as well is that we will allow for grades 6 through 12, when we are in this more sedentary, static type of instructional mode, if we would happen to get to that point, we'll have times for each group to have physical activity time throughout the day, so that they might have an hour of the day or a certain amount of minutes where they can get some physical activity, so they will not be sedentary throughout the entire school day. Finally, the final category is activities. And so first we're going to look at things that we'll do when we're in low, moderate, or high spread. First off, for high school, we'll follow NSAA guidelines to the extent possible, but we also have additional guidance we will follow. There's a link to what has been released so far by the NSAA, the Activities Association, and there's very likely there will be forthcoming guidance, and we will follow that. The junior high sports and activities are not technically governed by the NSAA, but with junior high activities as well as other non-activity association activities such as FFA, NHS, Quiz Bowl, Student Council, etc. We'll still continue to follow NSAA guidelines for that. I want to talk about a little bit about public performances and large gatherings at the school. Other than contests that are governed by the NSAA, public performances such as music concerts, banquets, fun nights, and other gatherings in the school building are just going to be postponed or canceled until the pandemic is over. When we get in, when we look at the lower moderate category, contests that are in, we will have contests that are NSAA governed. If we do have indoor contests like basketball games, volleyball matches, play production, festivals, football games, football would be outdoor, excuse me, but indoor public performances, contests will be allowed. Performances will not be allowed. Anything that's not governed by the NSAA. And that's simply because we are bound to follow the Activity Association guidelines. Those guidelines could become stricter, but as of right now, we will follow those guidelines. Outdoor public performances will be allowed. So for example, if the band wanted to have a concert outside and the weather was agreeable, we could look at doing something like that. We would still march in a parade with the marching band, or the band would play at a football game. And obviously, if there's a football game, the football team would be playing as well. Spectators at these events must follow NSAA guidance. Presently, we're in phase 3 of reopening in our county, in Pawnee County, which means that indoor capacity is at 50% and outdoor capacity of seating is 75%. When we move into phase 4, that'll be 75% for indoor and 100% for outdoor. We haven't worked out all the details of how we're going to enforce that, but we will before our first public contest. We do encourage, particularly for indoor activities, for spectators in attendance to wear face masks. We will not be enforcing that, but we will encourage it. For the high spread, and I missed it, when we are in, oh, I didn't go far enough, that's why. When we are in the low to moderate spread, food service concessions will be allowed, but there will be some limitations on the types of items they can serve, where the condiments will be located, and that sort of thing. Things like fundraiser meals, soup suppers, those sort of things are just going to need to discontinue until the pandemic concludes. We will in this category continue to allow field trips and college visits if administration deems it to be safe. So we'll really be looking at where they're going and what the conditions are like, the location they're going. That's why we're going to encourage teachers and sponsors to look at local, try to look for more local field trips and outings, and places that provide that can provide adequate social distancing. Now, when we get into the high spread category, we're going to stop having any type of off-site activities, such as field trips, college visits, maybe working as a student group at some activity off campus. We're going to really limit that type of activity. We'll also not allow outdoor public performances other than those that are governed by the NSAA. Excuse me, I take that back. If we are in high spread zone, even NSAA governed activities will discontinue. I misstated there. So teams and organizations will be allowed to continue to practice, but we will not allow, if we are in the high spread category, contests will either be postponed or canceled during this time between opposing teams. Additionally, we'll be looking at the teams that will be playing. So there may be a situation where we are in lower moderate spread, but the community that the visiting school is coming from is in high spread. We will, or the comparable category in their particular health district, we will not allow those contests to occur. Much the same if we're traveling to a location that has high spread, we will not allow those to occur. So that's pretty much all been addressed. And then of course, when we are in severe spread, we will have no activities whatsoever. They will discontinue until we can resume. Now, certainly we hope that we can stay in this green mode throughout the school year. That would be the ideal situation. But we want to be prepared, much more prepared than we were last year for a scenario where we have to be worst case scenario, learning from home. And that being said, I think I've gone a little over 35 minutes here. For those of you who've watched this entire video, thank you for bearing with me. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to the participation of parents and community members to really make this a successful year. Our goal is to have activities throughout the school year, and in order for that to happen, we need cooperation, not just within the school, but with parents and with community members. And we thank you for your patience in this difficult time. And we are eager, and that's why we started school early. We are eager to get your children back to school on August 4th. And we look forward to that day, and we will pray for the best conditions throughout the school year. Thank you and goodbye.